Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Austin Coppock, and we're going to be looking at the astrological forecast for November of 2025. Hey, Austin, welcome back.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
It's going good. It's going very well. I'm excited about this episode and to talk to you and to catch up. We're going to spend the first hour talking about news and events that happened since the last forecast we did a month ago and the astrological correlations we found with those news stories. Then we're going to spend the second hour doing a deep dive into the astrology of November. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So here is the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and where they'll end up by the end of the month. And this month, one of the main alignments that's happening is this pretty heavy Mercury retrograde that's taking place in Sagittarius and Scorpio, where Mercury is going to slow down and station retrograde on November 9th, and Mars is going to conjoin it around that time, which is pretty tricky. And this new graphic was designed, this is a new experiment for a graphic that was designed by graphic designer Paige Herbert for us, who I've been working with to do the horary course graphics over the past couple of years. But we wanted to experiment with this new format to try to show you a little bit better what the astronomy of this retrograde actually looks like. So next is the planetary alignments calendar, just to give you a quick breakdown of the astrology of November before we get into the news. So right away at the beginning of the month, Mars moves from Scorpio into Sagittarius on November 4th. And the same day, Mars exactly opposes Uranus in one of the tensest and most explosive aspects of the month. The very next day, we get our first lunation, which is a full moon in the sign of Taurus. Then Venus moves into Scorpio the day after that. Uranus retrogrades back into Taurus for its final trek through that sign on November 7th, and the same day Venus squares Pluto. Then 2 days later, Mercury stations retrograde in Sagittarius on the 9th. Jupiter stations retrograde at 25 degrees of Cancer a couple days after that, while trining Saturn very closely. And then the following day, Mars catches up to and conjoins Mercury on November 12th in one of our tensest aspects of the month, besides the Mars Uranus opposition on the 4th. The following week, Mercury retrogrades from Sagittarius back into Scorpio on the 18th. Then it immediately opposes Uranus on the 19th. The Mercury cazimi, which is the halfway point through the cycle, occurs on the very next day, which is the same day as our second lunation of the month, which is a new moon in Scorpio. We also have the outer planets Uranus and Neptune forming an exact sextile on that day. Then the following day, on the 21st, the sun moves into Sagittarius, and Sagittarius season begins officially. And the same day, the sun opposes Uranus right before it switches signs. The following week, right at the beginning of the week on Monday, the 24th, a retrograde Mercury conjoins Venus. Then a few days later, Saturn stations direct in Pisces for its final station in that sign before it starts heading out of Pisces for good over the course of the next few months on November 27th. Then Mercury stations direct on the 29th, and the same day Venus opposes Uranus. And finally, Venus departs from Scorpio and moves into Sagittarius on the final day of the month on November 30th. So that is the quick overview of the few little alignments we have to talk about this month. Not a lot of alignments, but we're going to talk about news, and then we'll get into going into the interpretation of those alignments in more detail in about an hour. All right, Austin, welcome back. Thanks for joining me. We made it through October. October was kind of crazy. Mars was just bulldozing all over all of my stuff in Scorpio all month. But I do have some good news that the Astrology Podcast website is currently back online, and I've been able to recover it, rebuild the website new, and it's currently online and functional. So I am very conscious that I had to relaunch it to get it up so I could release the audio version of this episode as Mercury's in its shadow and getting ready to station retrograde. So I'm not making any promises about stability of everything over the next few weeks, but I'm at least in the process of bringing things back and getting a handle on it. So I'm really excited about that because it's been a long month since the website crashed and was taken offline in October. And I know a lot of people were missing the audio feeds and wondering why it wasn't on Spotify or iTunes or other places like that. That's the reason. But now hopefully it's back and we can get caught up and get back to where we were before that. So good news, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry that happened to you. The uh we could, instead of doing a review of what happened in the world for the Mercury-Mars in Scorpio, we could just review your life. I know
Right.
you kind of um I had some unpleasantness as a result, but it kind of ran roughshod over your works. So I mean, we've got more Mercury Mars to come, but it won't be in Scorpio. Fingers crossed, mostly for
Yeah.
you. I
There's
I
going to be
spent. Oh,
other
go ahead.
things. There'll be some other things coming up with that Mercury slowing down to station retrograde conjunct Mars. Not super stoked about a second one of those aspects, but we will stay on our feet and see how it goes. What's been going on with you? How have you been?
Oh, I think I spent a lot of October just sort of slowly recovering from my eclipse hangover. That
Totally.
eclipse, that eclipse at the end of September really set a lot of things in motion, and one of them just being some health challenges. And
Mhm.
so it was. The short version of it was that it was twice as much work with half as much help and have as much energy. And so just kind of run down. Feeling what might be some oats again. We'll see.
Nice.
Might be a less fortuitous grain, but we'll find out.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I was surprised to see a lot of people slowly coming out of the eclipse season as we moved further and further into October, especially once the first lunation hit that wasn't an eclipse seemed to be a definite stage. And then there was like a whole nother stage once the second lunation hit that wasn't an eclipse, and just a lot of people piecing things together that had like fallen apart or gotten seriously shaken up in September during that eclipse season, with like Uranus stationing in Gemini and with Mars going to Scorpio and everything else.
Yeah, that was exactly it. The I was expecting the full moon, which was the first non-eclipse lunation, to fully pull me out of it. And the how should you say, the baleful rays of the eclipse did indeed cease from that point onward. But when something's broken, just because it's not being actively smashed with a hammer, it doesn't instantly reknit itself. Like, things take time to repair once they've been busted, whether it's the stairs on your deck or your body or your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And things take time to rebuild, like wounds take time to heal, and various other both metaphors, but also in some instances, like literally in some people's cases, like those were things, and it takes a while for those things to go on and for healing to take place.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad the further away from some of that we move. I'm happy about that. So we're gonna do a little bit shorter of a news section today. I'm not even gonna attempt to like cover all of the news stories that happened over the last month. There was just way too much. And my birthday is tomorrow, so I wanna. We're recording this like the day before on Halloween, but I don't want to spend all night or my birthday like editing this episode. So I'm going to try to keep this episode to 2 hours if we can and keep the news section shorter. As a result of that, we'll talk about a handful of news sections, but we're also going to gloss or miss a lot. We did not dress up, unfortunately, for Halloween. We did that. I don't know if you wanted to do that. We guess we didn't really talk about it, yeah?
I thought about wearing I've got a button up that just has bones on it, like skeleton style, but I feel like it might be sort of cursed to wear that on the podcast, because the only other time I wore that on the podcast was the December 2019 episode. So,
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking is we did all dress up like a few years back when Patrick co-hosted an episode, a forecast with us, but then it's just like sometimes we'll do a forecast episode and then some tragedy will happen or there'll be some like major news event, and I'm just imagining like us ending up in the news on like CNN, like a clip from the podcast, and it flashes to what the astrologers said, and it's like I'm dressed up in like a beard and a wizard hat or something like that.
well, the good news is that no one watches CNN anymore.
Okay. Well, yeah, fill in your favorite news station or propaganda outlet or what have you. All right. Let's
I
let's
Okay, I do vote 2026 Halloween, you wear a beard and wizard hat. I think that's a really stunning idea.
All right, we'll take a poll. I mean, if people in the comments want that to happen, then let me know in the comments section, and I'll count them up, and we'll see how it comes out. And next year, I'll let everyone know the results. All right, let's get into the news section. So last month, the main alignment that we focused on in the forecast episode, because it looked like the toughest alignment, was the Mercury-Mars conjunction that took place in Scorpio on October 20th. And indeed, around that time, around when the conjunction was going exact on that day and the day before when it was still forming, there was all sorts of news stories that really fit the quality of that conjunction in a significant way. So I'll just read them off real quick and then we can discuss them. But it was like the Louvre jewelry heist happened on October 19th, exactly around 9:30 in the morning when the Mercury-Mars conjunction in Scorpio was like rising up over the eastern horizon at the ascendant at that moment. AWS, Amazon's web server crashed and took out like a huge swath of the internet, like tons and tons of sites, millions of users were affected. Windows released an update which introduced a critical bug, and this got widely reported on October 20th, how it bricked a bunch of Windows computers and forced a massive update, like emergency update. And then finally on October 20th, that was the first day that the pictures started coming out of the east wing of the White House being torn down in order to make way for Trump building a ballroom there. And yeah, so that was then also became like a major topic of discussion as well. So I'm sure there was other stuff, but those are like the four major news stories that I was just marveling at the different ways that the archetype and symbolism of Mercury Mars like manifested in different ways in each of those stories.
Yeah, each one of those is very archetypally perfect, right? We have communications and tech with Mercury, and then Mars. Mars being a malefic meaning that it often brings a destructive or interruptive sort of force, and so. Right, like we had the Mercury things were disrupted or fucked up, like the Windows 11 update, right? Here's a new operating system, right, which is a way of organizing and navigating and, therefore traveling from piece of data to program, very mercurial. And Windows 11 has been the least successful Windows update since Windows began. The only other more contentious update of an operating system was when Microsoft went from MS DOS to Windows, which was a very long time ago. And so there was the specific instance that you described. There was also the fact that Windows 11 won't run on a lot of computers, and so even people who want to update to the heinous new spyware regime or new and improved spyware regime can't. And so face, and this is another Mercury Mars keyword or key concept, face ever decreasing security of their machine and their data. Is another thing that Mercury Mars does is it brings intruders, it brings thieves, it brings parasites, it brings people who might hack your website or steal your paintings or valuable sculptures. And so one of the immediate consequence for tens of millions of users for Windows is being ever more vulnerable, right? And then the update has also been greeted with widespread rage, and so Mars brings anger, rage, resentment, irritation, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I have currently not yet updated, and I really want there to be a way that I don't have to, but I don't want
Mhm.
to get a part-time job making my machine run on Linux. I'm
Right. Yeah, cool. Because that and what you're saying is really important. That was the broader thing that was also happening that week is that Windows discontinued support at the same time for Windows 10, which means it's no longer going to get security updates, which means everyone that does stick to it is going to have their computer be much more vulnerable to hacking and malware and all sorts of things like that than it would have been up to that point. So that was another thing that coincided with the Mercury-Mars conjunction. And right in the middle of October. And I actually last month, Levant Laszlo, as part of the Horai project, where he translates ancient Greek astrological texts, he actually translated this passage from Rhetorius about Mercury-Mars squares, and it just reminded me of how theft was like one of the major things that the ancient astrologers associate with hard aspects between Mars and Mercury. So I was going to read that passage really quickly. It says, um, see that Hermes overcomes Mars by tetragon, for one of the sages says, quote, but if being foresighted, Hermes holds the upper place, while the most base Ares, Mars, a low one, he affects cunning, deceitful ones, or plotting plunderers, and deprivers of others' possessions, and shows wandering from one man to another man, while other times we might find that they cause harm as traitors with their evil device, and they will strip them of their property. So I thought that was amazing because he just happened to translate that as part of something else last month. But right at that time, where I'm seeing like these news headlines of like Mercury Mars conjunction and this high stakes like jewelry heist takes place in the middle of broad daylight with thieves breaking into the Louvre and then stealing a bunch of really valuable diamonds and like running off with them.
Yeah, perfect. I got some quotes for you too. So from the Riley translation of Valence,
Hmm.
in discussing people who have Mercury and Mars together in their nativity, he writes that they resort to forgery in order to embezzle, steal, and loot. And having fallen into debt and expenses, they bring on themselves infamy and hot pursuit. Right.
Hmm. I
Um,
like that.
and then Firmicus says that those who have them in the same place, it says they're smart, right? But liars and adept at every evil deed. They use their intelligence for all kinds of trickery and meet every contest with malice and fraud.
Hmm.
So,
Nice. Yeah.
so yeah, sneaky, sneaky, sneaky.
Yeah, I like that. Well, it's a great example that, obviously not everybody that has those alignments, there's going to be positive and constructive ways you can manifest those alignments, like being good in argumentation, being quick-witted, being like a lawyer or something like that, which
Hmm.
arguably is like positive, negative. But there's less constructive ways, or there's ways that you can use certain placements for not good deeds, basically. Especially certain combinations, but it's a good example of, sometimes you'll pick up some of the ancient texts, like especially Firmicus, and he's often very over the top about talking about how bad certain combinations are. And, sometimes you have to read between the lines, but sometimes like those combinations do manifest very literally. And it's important to understand the extreme literal, sometimes negative possible manifestations of certain combinations. And I think this is a good example for a lot of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when we're looking at the news, we're mostly going to see the negative version.
Mm.
Because when things work out pretty good or there are some difficulties, but they are swiftly averted, that doesn't make the news, right? Like things that are either extraordinarily positive or extra negative are the things that make it through the news filter. But just as an
Right. Like
example,
we
oh,
didn't see like the public defender who successfully argued and defended their client in court that day, for example.
yeah, or I had a discussion with a student in one of my classes that got a little heated, but then we both drew back and came to a really good resolution and a greater a greater understanding of the topic. Right? It
Right.
was like like nobody. I guess I talked about that, but and it's worth noting. Just Firmicus continues after every contest being met with fraud and malice. He's like, but if Jupiter's in favorable aspect, it indicates fame in athletic contests, right? Mercury and Mars both like contests, and with a little bit of refereeing from Jupiter, that same like hyper competitive, I'm going to get mine, just becomes a fierce and effective competitor, not a malicious fraud who will resort to forgery to embezzle, steal, and loot.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And then Mercury is also technical, it's technology. And the AWS crash was entertaining because AWS is Amazon is like the server that like I don't know, like half of the internet is hosted on, or some crazy like percentage of the internet, at least like a third of it or something of major websites are hosted on that. And that's what crashed. So it took down all these major sites. But that day it was funny. I was laughing because even like I went to order like food from the place down the street and their ordering app wasn't working because AWS was down. So it's like sometimes there were very tangible ways that the interruption of technology that was indicated that day sort of arose or
Yeah,
presented.
I have a lot of my recorded classes backed up on AWS. And
Mm,
so my students, when they're like, okay, I want to listen to lesson 4 of module 7, and clicked on that day, just got an error, right? Which was probably Mars, a frustrating experience.
absolutely. Yeah, and lots of people had that with like tons of social media sites were down and other things like that. So, and then the final thing today that was that day that was interesting astrologically was just the tearing down of the East Wing started that day, which then began at least like a week or more that's been being discussed by everybody. And Lisa Shine pointed out to me that this was actually happening in Trump's fourth house. And he's the one
Mm.
living there, like at the White House right now. And so the Mercury-Mars conjunction was actually happening in his fourth house, and he was the one that was like tearing down part of that house that he was living in, basically. But it also, one of the points that Lisa made to me that I thought was brilliant was like, we often talk about how when a person becomes the leader of the country, their chart becomes symbolically significant for the country as a whole to some extent, and how the White House is sometimes referred to as like the people's house, for example. So it was really fascinating that it was like a fourth house transit happening in Trump's house, but it had larger implications for like the country and our national history and other things like that.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great example of that way of it, that doctrine, or just that observation that what's going on with the leader of a country affects more than just their personal life.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so moving on, in other news, the other major thing that happened this month, right in the middle of October, I think it was around October 13th, was Pluto stationed direct in Aquarius. And when that happened, I thought it was really important because I was reflecting on it a lot, and something I didn't reflect on as enough in the previous forecast until I actually experienced the Pluto station is I realized this was actually the first time that Pluto was stationing direct in Aquarius, because a year ago, when Pluto stationed direct the last time, it actually stationed direct in Capricorn. So this was the first time that Pluto, moved through Aquarius in 2025, went retrograde earlier in the year, and then came back all the way to the beginning of Aquarius. But then instead of falling back into Capricorn, it slowed down and stopped right at the beginning of Aquarius and started moving forward again. And one of my experiences of that and the way I was like feeling it at the time and seeing the news stories was just this feeling of, the world has changed and there's no going back. Like we are now firmly in this new era of whatever this is for the next 20 years that we've been seeing the beginnings of since 2022, I think, since Pluto first started going into Aquarius. But now we're there and there's no going back to that earlier era at this point. And one of the ways I saw that manifest in the news stories is that day when Pluto was stationing, there was this story that was making headlines of this research article that said that AI generated content now was starting to either match or exceed human generated content on the internet. And it showed this graph where this started around 2022 when ChatGPT came out, which is around the same time Pluto went into Aquarius. But then you see the graph of like human and AI generated content start to converge, and then eventually now it's like fully converged so that AI generated content is starting to exceed the content that humans are creating on the internet. So I thought that was a wild story to me, hitting the headlines on that day that Pluto is stationing direct for the first time in Aquarius.
Yeah, I saw that graph as well, and experienced the shadow of its dire consequence. Um, and another way to frame that is that humans are now using AI to produce half of the content, right? Because it's
Yeah.
the AI is not spontaneously doing all of these things, but it just in terms of what people are doing and what people are being incentivized to do by the environment, right? People don't want to make their own things. I know that I've second guessed the idea of creating things because of the environment that there is now no going back from. Right? It's like, oh, why bother writing something if it'll just get scraped?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was the other thing that launched this month. It was a big Pluto and Aquarius technology and possibly Mercury-Mars thing was Elon launched Grokkapedia. He launched a rival to Wikipedia that's entirely AI generated and draws on all of these internet articles and other things like that, and then creates that's new generated articles that are his intent is to make it match his political views, basically. So that was the other major, possibly important historic turning point in terms of now somebody trying to create either a rival or something to get rid of Wikipedia or whatever that becomes.
Yeah, that feels very in line with the potential horror of the Pluto in Aquarius placement. The replacement of um the replacement of the human attempt, the flawed human attempt to collect knowledge, right? Because Wikipedia is not perfect, it's flawed, things get changed, things get edited, and they're still not perfect. But then to replace that with a much more fundamentally flawed simulacrum feels very par for the course. It really this point of no return for the AI infected present and future really makes you appreciate human frailty and mistakes. Because the mistakes that we're now getting used to and the distortions that we're now beginning to get used to with AI are like in a whole nother layer of monstrous, right? Because they not only repeat and compound, or they not only repeat, but they also compound the human mistakes. Um, it's amazing, and I think that to your point that there's no going back, right, or the point that there is going back to, right, which is the planet's retrograde, is still in Aquarius. We're not going back to Pluto and Capricorn, and I think that you could see a lot of the news articles and commentary pieces from October through this lens, where it's a lot of people in different fields, financial and otherwise, grappling with, okay, so we can't steer around or get away from this AI future. So what does that mean? Like, what does it mean that there just is this massive, likely overinvestment, that all this money is stuck in AI now? What does it mean? Is this a bubble that's going to burst? If so, when is it? Like, like, what do we do from here, rather than like, oh, it'll pass, right? Like, oh, like there's no dismissing it. There's only what is the smart way to get through it, and where is it going?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point that brings up the Saturn-Neptune conjunction as well. Real quickly, one of the reasons I mentioned the rival to Wikipedia though is because I was reading some of the articles about astrology and I could see instances where things that I had written were influencing things that it was saying about like Hellenistic astrology, but I didn't see citations of like my book or what have you. So that's one of the annoying things now in this new era as well, is everything's just being fed into the AI generated things and everyone's content is being repurposed in that way and not necessarily with attribution. So it's going to be weird seeing, what happens to humans like in that context and what happens to human creative output when it's just getting fed in and repurposed in different ways by these different AI machines that don't necessarily give credit or links back or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, it it increasingly throws the like it throws the idea of intellectual property into question and begs desperately for a reformulation of it. Because when people cannot benefit from putting together ideas or writing books or doing research, when there's no incentive to do that, or the incentive is almost nothing because it just gets scraped and thrown into the vat, what like you're going to have people doing less research and less thinking and putting out less material. And that's, that's of course what's implied by the ominous graph that you mentioned earlier with the convergence. And so, like, as far as longer term things, like intellectual property laws are going to need to be reformulated. Whether they will be and on what timeline, who knows?
Yeah.
But like, you can't disincentivize the all human thought and publication, or you can, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Let me show that graph really quickly. Let me see if there's a way I can show that just because so I don't have to do it in post and can enjoy my birthday without doing a bunch of editing. But here's that graph because it's very visually striking. And there's different things about like the sample size, like is this representative? Was it a large enough sample size? I don't even aside for that, I don't really care. The emphasis of this makes sense, and the general trend is something that
Mhm.
we're all seeing and that we've been seeing for the past few years. But here's the graph where you can see like human generated content on top and then AI generated content down below. And then around 2022, just this shift where you start seeing more and more AI generated content and less human generated content. And then all of a sudden now in 2024 and 2025, they are converging and AI generated content is threatening to switch to the other side. So that's one thing, just to visualize that. The other thing that really visualized Pluto stationing direct in Aquarius and the no going back theme for me this month was later in the month, a company launched this home robot called Neo. And there were these kind of creepy videos about it, but it was like a supposed home robot that's supposed to do like chores and like tasks for you and stuff. And they released these videos of it going around and doing things. And it's kind of like basic and janky. And there's questions about whether this is actually a fully realized product yet, or if it's just like the Saturn-Neptune dream or like vision of a product. But the thing that it left to me is just knowing that Pluto's only in like 1 degree of Aquarius right now, stationing direct, and we have 20 years of that transit. So we can see the seeds of that transit laying here with where they're going with this and what they're trying to do. And just imagine, 20 years of iterations of this and where we're going to be by the end of Pluto and Aquarius. I felt like this month with Pluto stationing that I could see it very clearly for the first time. What do you think? You're feeling good about it? You're going to get a Neo home robot?
Yeah. Why pay for a babysitter when a completely trustworthy, faceless robot could, maybe equipped within some sort of AI to entertain my child, would do such a good and loving and caring job of taking care of my spawn? No, it's horrifying.
Yeah.
It is telling in right in that sense that that like you can know that this is where things are pointed, right? Whether the goal is accomplished or not is another thing, but that untold billions of dollars will be spent in moving in this direction,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
how many I don't know. All I can think of are horrible things with that robot. We talked about that. Like it immediately conjures, these images of the robot just walking around the home. Just conjure for me images of like petting a cat to death completely impassively, like thinking that your child is laundry and trying to fold it, like all of the many horrific mishaps. Like it's all going to happen, right? It's all going to happen. And whether we
Right.
get super cool robots as a result or not, I don't know. But we're certainly going to, certainly all the mistakes along the way will be made, whether there's any great success at the end. You know, one of the things I'm haunted by with a lot of this new, how should we say, next this generation of technologies is the metaverse and virtual reality, and how for my entire childhood and growing up. Because I played video games, everybody was like, dude, we're going to get virtual reality and it's going to be fucking awesome. And it was always next year. And it got closer and closer. And then VR headsets came out and they kind of did it and it kind of sucked and just made you sick. Like, and you know, we had the metaverse, right? We had Zuck's metaverse, which was a giant sickening failure. And just because something has lived in our sci-fi dreams for decades and decades doesn't mean that when it arrives, it's going to be as awesome as we thought it was when we were children, right? And so I just wonder of all these things, which of them are going to be quite disappointing upon delivery. I don't believe in the inevitable success of all these things.
Yeah, well, and that was one of the things I was watching some tech guys talk about this robot yesterday, and they were saying like that the AI technology and everything isn't even fully there yet, so that one of the things it does have built in is that they can have a person like remote control go into the robot and control it remotely from the company. So instead now you have a robot that's being who with somebody driving it who's inside your house like doing the stuff, and the potential for that, which is even more fun in terms of the implications and everything else. I think you would agree.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that I mean it. That's amazing.
Maybe I
Um,
shouldn't actually. Maybe we should drop the sarcasm because I've realized recently it doesn't read in transcripts. In transcripts, it sounds like we're
oh,
totally
Austin just says
agreeing.
that is amazing, Chris.
Yeah, Austin's like, I'm fully on board with that. I'm ordering a prototype now.
Yeah,
Um,
I wish one was hovering 6 inches away from me, staring at the side of my head.
right. So speaking of, was there something else I meant to say about speaking of that? But that's actually the point of what you're just saying to close that loop, which is the Saturn Neptune is happening right now at the same time, and there's some products. What I saw this guy saying yesterday, like this, that is like they're selling the dream of something
Hmm.
that might be fully true in the future, but it's not quite there yet. And that brings up this broader thing that got really intense this month about everybody realizing we're in an AI bubble and that the economy is entirely being held up right now by a handful of a few companies doing AI stuff. But that if that bubble pops, then we're all in big trouble because that's like, everything else has become so tenuous at this point economically.
Yeah, well, and a lot of things are not actually being held up by that. Like the big numbers, like GDP and the numbers in the stock market are absolutely being held up. But like you know, I read recently that somewhere near half of the states in the United States are in recession territory in terms of their actual economies. Right, it holds up like some of the big numbers. It certainly holds up if you're investing in these things, but some of that is an illusion, and there's something to be said for the power of an illusion to hold things together. But
Mhm.
even that illusory potency, would be gone if there was a pop. There's also a piece that I listened to recently that I thought was really interesting, and it was about how The Economist in 1997 said there's a tech bubble, and this is exactly why, and this is exactly what the pop will look like, and they nailed it, and they were 3.5 years early.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so
What?
like the simply knowing that something is a bubble and is is not necessarily an indicator that we're in pop land, but it is extremely discomforting.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was fascinated by this month is, I'd been waiting for October because that was the repetition of where Venus was, to put it really simply, going back to 1929. And all of
Hmm.
a sudden in October this month, there was all this discussion about 1929, and like a famous MSNBC host, or not, CNBC host, I think. He published a book about the 1929 stock market crash. And as a result of that, he was doing like a bunch of media interviews everywhere talking about it. And so there was all this discussion about 1929, and there was a real repetition in terms of that really coming back in people's minds, especially with everyone coming to this increasingly nervous making realization that we're kind of in bubble land right now, and everyone's waiting for the other shoe to drop in terms of when that could pop.
Yeah, and it there's this sense of living in a house that is deeply structurally unsound, like that has been condemned, and yet you can't live out, or excuse me, you can't live out, you can't move out. And so every little like creak and groan that a house might make carries the implication of potential collapse, right? And so, but you can't repair the house, and you can't move out. Maybe you can move to you can locate yourself in a room that is less vulnerable to collapse, but there it brings a sort of state of structural or yes, a particular flavor of paranoia that's based in reality, and yet also like becomes irrational because every little thing seems like it might be an indication that the whole thing's going to come down.
Yeah, absolutely. One last point to mention here to circle back to something you said about the robots and like Pluto and Aquarius and everything else. It reminded me that there were headlines because Elon Musk made headlines this month because on an early earnings call later in October, after Pluto was like stationing direct and Mercury-Mars were going exact, he was arguing for getting this payout, and he started making these statements where he said, quote, he said he had concerns because he said, quote, if we build this robot army, do I have at least a strong influence over that robot army? Not current control, but a strong influence. And then he said, I don't feel comfortable building that robot army if I didn't at least have a strong influence. And then the third quote was, quote, my fundamental concern is if I go ahead and build this enormous robot army, can I just be ousted at some point in the future? So he made headlines because he kept using the phrase robot army, which is like not the phrase like I want to be hearing right now at the beginning of Pluto and Aquarius, especially seeing that other robot like walking around inside people's homes. But robot army, unfortunately, with Pluto stationing this month, might be a key word that unfortunately is going to haunt us for some time to come.
Yeah, it's funny. It's all of these sci-fi dreams and nightmares, right? And we can't tell or it's very difficult to tell which ones are merely phantoms and which sci-fi dreams and nightmares will appear prophetic in retrospect, right? Because that's the Terminators, right? That's Skynet. Skynet took over with a robot army.
Right.
They're
Or that Will Smith movie from like 20 years ago. What was it
Right.
called?
iRobot, which is based on a classic based ish on a classic Isaac Asimov novel. It's like it's one of the tech dreams, and it's really interesting to see what happens when these dreams hit the wave of technology that makes them potentially real.
Yeah, yeah. I meant to say, like, I laugh sometimes, but none of this is funny. I'm just like so exasperated that there's nothing you can do but laugh at like how bad some stuff is getting, and like what a weird dystopian timeline that we're on, and that in some ways we're like we found ourselves somehow in the worst timeline. And so that in some instances, like there's nothing you can do but just like laugh at like how bizarre it's getting.
Yeah, it's definitely Clown Town. I was talking to you the other day about I was looking at this period in 2019, and it just seemed like it would be mind-bogglingly stupid and surreal. And yeah, I couldn't even. imagine what was going to be here because I was looking at 2025 as this big hinge point and just how silly the Neptune Saturn stuff was going to be, but how it was going to be real. And when you make the absurd real, it usually ends up in the horror genre. And I was just, just knowing that you couldn't possibly time travel back and be like, okay, so this is the case. It would seem silly. And yet here we are.
Right.
And when the absurd becomes literal, it becomes more disturbing than comedic.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, all right. So two more heavy, not good news stories to wrap up this section. One of them is Venezuela. A lot of news this month that Trump is building up forces near Venezuela and has sent a carrier there, among other things, and it's being reported. People are saying, news sources are saying that he seems to be trying to depose or may have plans to depose the leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, there. And when a lot of news sources were comparing this to the 1989 time period when the US deposed Manuel Noriega in Panama, and that
Mm,
immediately like caught my attention because in the Saturn Neptune episode that we did earlier this year, we talked about that happening in 1989 and how that coincided with a Saturn Neptune conjunction. So that immediately made me think of this basically being a recurrence transit 40 years later when Saturn and Neptune are again forming in the sky, and the US is like again posturing itself to potentially like depose the leader of another country in South America.
hmm Yeah, that's a really good call.
Yeah, so that's one piece of news I wanted to mention in passing. And then the last one, also very not great, is do you remember in the year ahead forecast when we were talking about Uranus and Gemini, I had a little segment talking about atomic weapons. Um, and the reason I had that is because what I said in the forecast was that with Uranus coming back to Gemini, one of the things that it made me realize was that we're also returning back to the last time uh, Uranus was in Gemini when nuclear weapons were developed, and the only time so far that they've ever been used in war on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what happened, and so I was anticipating that that would come back and come up again. And actually, let me read the quote just so I'm clear, like what I actually said and what you said actually in the um, same forecast. So this is from the transcript from our year ahead astrology forecast that we put out in December of 2024 for 2025. I said the last thing I wanted to mention in this section when we were talking about Uranus and Gemini, parenthetically, is that the atomic age began in 1945 when the US developed the nuclear bomb and detonated them. And that began both the nuclear arms race of the era of atomic weapons, but also the era of nuclear power as well, which went through different stages and different sort of like waxed and waned in popularity over the years. But something's happening right now where all of these big tech companies are putting a bunch of money into nuclear power suddenly because they are all realizing that they're going to need massive amounts of power to run these massive data centers that are necessary for artificial intelligence. So what's happening is a bunch of these companies are returning to nuclear power, and we may see during the course of this Uranus transit, which is itself a return back to when the nuclear or the atomic era began, both a return to nuclear power and the popularity of that, but also, potentially more problematically, returning back to that period of a turning point for nuclear weapons as well. And since the last and the only one that was used during war was used during the last period of Uranus and Gemini, and then you responded and agreed and you said, yeah, I think the planets plan to make nukes scary again. And then what happened this month is that on October 29th, just a few days ago, the day that Mercury opposed Uranus in the sky, Trump announced that he had instructed the US to immediately begin the process of starting to test nuclear weapons again. And so Trump has announced basically the US is going to start testing nukes again. And so nukes all of a sudden, which the US stopped testing them back in 1992 and 1993. That was the last time that the US detonated a nuclear bomb. It's potentially on the table again that they're going to start detonating them again. So that was a
Yeah.
pretty good, I mean, call. I feel like, yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Good call, true call. I think we citizens of planet Earth will be pretty lucky to get through Uranus and Gemini this time with no nuclear weapons being deployed.
Yeah, unfortunately, that confirmation of that prediction with Mercury opposing Uranus that day and having that announcement about nuclear weapons, and this being just the very beginning of Uranus and Gemini, that really does heighten the possibility again, which is a really grim, scary possibility for the next 7 to 8 years that Uranus is going to be transiting through Gemini. And in particular, when I started thinking about that over the past few days, I was thinking about it again, and it's like, Hiroshima was a Mars-Uranus conjunction in the sign of Gemini, which itself was a recurrence transit of the United States, which natally was born with a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini at the time of the Declaration of Independence. So it was like the country that developed and detonated nuclear weapons had this Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini in their birth chart, and then they developed and deployed nuclear weapons for the first and only time when the same alignment happened in the sky again. So, something you and I know and we've been talking about for a while that's coming up in the future is now that Uranus is back in Gemini for the next 7 to 8 years, we're going to have four Mars-Uranus conjunctions take place during the course of that time. And two of them we've already looked at because they fall in really critical, weird periods for the US, like the one next summer on July 4th, 2026, is the first Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini, right on the 4th of July and on the birthday of the US. Then 2 years later, there's another one on June 23rd, 2028, and another on June 15th, 2030, and then another on June 6th, 2032. So I don't like that the US is talking about bringing nuclear weapons tests back. Um, and that's not a good sign for the future to me, that I would like to like not see if we weren't going to go in that direction. But the fact that they are heightens the possibility that that could be really problematic in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's back on the menu for a while. And hopefully will not be the item selected, but I don't think that there will be an announcement from the administration that like, now we're just kidding, we're not going to do that. Like we're moving into a period of, or we've moved into a period where great power conflict is much more likely, or is already happening, but it um, uh, uh, leading to hot conflict or more proxy wars is kind of already happening and going to keep happening. Like the tensions, the frictions, and the need for or the seeming need for an escalation of force is the era we're already in. And there's nothing about the precedents for Uranus's time in Gemini that suggests that we'll see a significant de-escalation as soon as we would like.
Yeah, especially when we take into account the previous US history of always being involved in a major war, either externally, like World War II or the Revolutionary War, or internally, like it was when Uranus was in Gemini during the Civil War. So I think the next step then is we need to see what alignment happens if the US does conduct another nuclear test. I want to know what the alignment is when that happens because that may give us some further clues about if that Uranus in Gemini is going to continue to get activated and if that's the thing we need to pay attention to. Um, yeah. Uh, Actually, last thing about that, the last nuclear tests happened in 1992, and that was when Mars was in Cancer, getting ready to go retrograde in Cancer. And then in 1993, they basically started passing stuff in order to stop nuclear testing. And 1993, as I've talked about many times this year, that was a 32-year recurrence when Venus went retrograde in Aries and Mars went retrograde in Cancer, just like it did earlier this year. So that's the other thing that's connecting this period of time of the last time nuclear weapons were used in the US, basically, versus this time period where the same configurations recurred earlier this year when the new administration like came into office. Makes
Interesting.
sense?
Yeah. And it's sort of it does make sense. And it also historically times the sort of end of the Cold War or era of tense international geopolitical relations with the sort of re-beginning of a time of very tense international geopolitical relations. I don't know if it's I wouldn't say that we've entered a new Cold War. That's not going to be the name for this period of history. Um, and it probably happened several years ago, but obviousness with which the obviousness with which we are now present, the degree to which it is obvious that we are in a new era of much scarier relationships between nations and even within nations is very clear now. And so that's interesting that those recurrences time the end of an era and the new firm location within a new era, which again will be named hopefully quite cleverly at some point in the future.
Yeah, clever names. We'll have to work on that. Diana in the live chat of patrons who've joined us for this live recording today, shout out to all the patrons, says maybe there could be a new breakthrough in nuclear fusion technology. And I think that's a really great point because that is the other thing that was happening that was starting the atomic era at that time was nuclear power. And that was part of my original quote. And it does seem like they're at a critical point already right now. I've seen with some of the nuclear fusion and fission reactors. So that could actually be the thing over the next 7 years as well, is finally a turning point in terms of that and whether they start producing more energy than they take to get started, which has been the dream of that for years now that they are just barely starting to now achieve. So maybe we've also reached the critical turning point in terms of that, which potentially could be good for the world and for the environment and other things like that to move away from other fossil fuels and things like that.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great. It's another one of these long held sci fi dreams that may or may not be prophetic.
Yeah. So that's at least one positive, let's say, dream to keep in mind, hopefully, especially as we're moving into this era where the AI data centers and everything else is starting to use huge amounts of energy and the environmental impact of that and everything else. All right. So um, I think that's it for the news section. Is there anything else to mention? Do you have anything like positive that happened to you this month or anything else to wrap up this section?
No,
No, you got nothing.
I got
Um,
nothing.
I'm thinking really hard. It's been a rough month, so I don't necessarily have anything either, but the astrology has been impressive. I'll just say that I continue to be impressed by the astrology and I continue to be impressed by this is so simple of a concept, but applying and separating aspects, especially by transit, work so well. And sometimes an event does happen exactly as your transit is going exact. And I was like watching that happening several times this month when disastrous things were happening in my life, but just sitting back and kind of being impressed that like the planetary alignment that represented that I'd sometimes been anticipating and waiting like, okay, what's this going to be this weekend? This isn't going to be good. And then the event would happen like right on the alignment. I continue, going back to our hashtag astrologer good thing that we came up with maybe 10 years ago. I continue to be impressed by that, especially when an aspect is applying and still forming, and there's this feeling of tension that's increasing and peaks at the exact aspect. But then as soon as it starts separating, there is this flowing away and decreasing of the tension and a moving into past of what you experienced with that. And it's such a fundamental thing that almost doesn't bear repeating. And yet, when you experience it, it can be such a visceral experience to experience applying versus separating transits and aspects.
Yeah, it's so very important for looking at transits, for looking at how the astrology of a given time manifests in the news and the events, right? Is this a thing that's still coming into being, right? Are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg, or are we seeing the sea serpent like heading off into the distance and its spine sinking beneath the water? Are we seeing something on its way, or are we seeing something on the way out? And for those of you who haven't spent the time with your natal charts figuring out whether the aspects in it are applying or departing, it's very important, right? Were you coming? Was that hard? Was the difficult thing that the Venus square Saturn in someone's natal chart, was that coming into being and getting stronger, or had that already happened? Right. And you were just suffering the hangover from it, or the world was suffering the hangover from it as you were born. Same for the positive things, um, because it makes a big difference in interpretation and what you can expect and what you should expect.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. All right, cool. I think that's good. Why don't we take a little break?
All right, great. Yeah.
All right, I wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening next year, May 21st through the 25th, 2026, in Seattle, Washington. So you can join the Northwest Astrological Conference either in person in Seattle, or you can attend online from anywhere with their new affordable virtual streaming option. So NORWAC, if you're not familiar with it, the Northwest Astrology Conference, which we all lovingly refer to with its acronym NORWAC, is one of the longest running astrology conferences in the world. And the 2026 conference, they're making it a little bit more of an intimate gathering to be a little bit smaller than last year's on purpose. And part of the purpose of that is they're designing it to be easy to connect with speakers and easy to connect with other attendees so that you can make new friends in a welcoming and inclusive and community focused environment. Because NORWAC is run by a family, like generations of astrologers have been doing it for over 30, 40 years now. And they really focus on that like community element of everything. So at NORWAC, you can hear from over 30 leading astrologers who are going to be giving different topics and you can different lectures, and you can choose from a range of different lectures and workshops covering both modern as well as ancient techniques. So it's going to be an amazing conference, and you can either learn more or you can sign up by visiting norwac.net. And I'll put a link in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website that you can click to visit it and check out. And Austin, you'll be making an appearance at NORWAC next year, I hear.
Yeah, I'll be making a pair of appearances. I will be leading a pre-conference workshop, and I will also be giving a during the conference talk.
Fantastic. All right. Well, it's going to be a great conference, so definitely check it out. And especially if you're thinking about attending it in person, I remember tickets have sold out the past few years. So if you want to attend in person, then get your ticket early. But online tickets, of course, will be available from here until when the conference actually begins.
Yeah,
All right.
and insert sort of off-repeated, almost cliched, but definitely true statement about there's nothing like being there in person. It's true. It's cliche, but it's true. It's really nice. It's unique. The event has such an energy, and dare I say magic, that you get a whiff of from the online attendance. There's definitely there's some of it, but like there's nothing like being there.
Yeah, being there's nice. But online, one of the things that's nice about online is the past 2 years, they keep upping the online experience in order to include more community and discussion elements to bring the online people more into the mix. And I was actually impressed at how they did that this past year's conference. So for those of us that can't travel and be in there in person for health reasons or other reasons, it's a great alternative.
Yeah, it
So
is. And NORWAC is yeah, made efforts to improve that every year and capture a little bit more of the magic bit by bit. And you do have to wear pants if you attend in person, or you do have to cover your bottom, whereas that is not at all required if you attend online.
Austin, are you wearing pants right now?
I am. I'm actually wearing particularly well-fitting dress pants.
All right, I'm going to take your word for it just for my own peace of mind, and I will not inquire further.
There's
But
no
on that,
particular reason. I just woke up in them and I was like, hey, these are nice. Why did I go to sleep in these? Who knows?
all right. Well, thanks to Norwalk for sponsoring this message about Austin's pants, and visit
Hmm.
their website at norwalk.net. All right. I think that's good for the first half of this show. Let's transition into talking about the forecast for November and the major astrological alignments that are going on. So, I want to give a synopsis of just the major stuff from my vantage point that's happening this month, and then we can get into the details in chronological order. But the major alignments this month is like right away at the top of the month, right out of the gate, we have this explosive Mars-Uranus opposition that's happening right away around November 4th and the days surrounding that. And that's going to be a really tense aspect to start November with. Then immediately, like the following week, Mercury slows down and stations retrograde, and Mars comes up and conjoins it for a second time, which is going to bring back some of that energy that we had of the Mercury-Mars conjunction in October, but it's going to add a Mercury retrograde right on top of that, which is a lot of like miscommunication, delays, misunderstandings, but add like a fiery, argumentative, conflictual energy with Mars at the same time. And then Mercury's retrograde for the next 3 weeks for the rest of November until the end of the month. Then we have Uranus returning, retrograding, and returning back to Taurus early in the month as well, which is returning for unfinished business, going back to the 2018, 2019 timeframe when Uranus first went into that sign and first went into especially that whole sign house in our chart. So I want people to think about Uranus in terms of the fact that it's returning back to Taurus and returning to a certain whole sign house of your chart for unfinished business and to wrap some things up that you had already been doing since 2018 and 2019 in that sector of your life. And then along the same lines, the last major thing that happens this month is that Saturn has retrograded back into Pisces, and it's going to make its final station in Pisces late this month in November. And a station is always like an exclamation mark and like a planet speaking loudly. So this is the last big message about what was learned and what we were supposed to learn, and about the experience that we had over the course of the past 2.5 years, ever since Saturn moved into Pisces in March of 2023 and moved into that whole sign house in whatever sector of our chart that it's been transiting since that time. We're getting Saturn coming back, throwing out a reminder and throwing out some final changes in that area of our life before it hightails it out of there and heads into Aries for good early next year. So those are the main things I wanted to focus on and talk about this month that I think are the most important. What do you think?
I agree. I think those are the I don't know if highlights is the right word, but those are the most useful things to know about the month and to have in mind as we walk through it.
Absolutely. One last thing I forgot to mention, Jupiter's stationing retrograde in Cancer while trining Saturn at the same time. And the part about trining Saturn, I think, is actually really good for the Saturn sector of our chart. But I thought that was an important thing to mention as well, is just that Jupiter station in Cancer we'll talk about a little bit as well. All right, so where do we start? Let me pull up the actual chart for the 1st of November, because one of the things I want to do is like go through chronologically the alignments this month, showing them on a chart. This is today. We're literally recording this. I'm going to try to turn this episode around. We're recording it today on October 31st. I'm going to try to get it released tonight or tomorrow. And these are the alignments at the beginning of the month. And that actually makes me realize I want to give the electional chart for this month, because the electional chart for this month is literally on the first day of November. Unfortunately, sorry for the lack of heads up. If you're patron, you learned about this a week ago when I did the Electional Astrology Podcast and released our best dates for November. But for those of you, our best chart that we found in that podcast that I did want to share here is on November 1st. Um, earlier, no, actually, it's later in the day, later in the afternoon with Pisces rising. So the best chart is November 1st, and then set the chart for about 3:45 p.m. local time. Wherever you're at, just adjust it, set it for your city, and then at 3:45 in your location, like don't adjust the time zones or anything. It's 3:45 local time. You should get about something similar to this chart with Pisces rising. So, part of the reason this is the best chart for the month is it's before a lot of the trickiest stuff really sets in. So it's about a week before Mercury stations retrograde fully, for example, or it's before Mars has departed from Scorpio and moved fully into Sagittarius and then exactly opposes Uranus. So unfortunately, Mars is already like heading into that opposition with Uranus that is built into this chart. But I assure you, from what I've seen, I have a hard time recommending a lot of the charts later in the month that are really much better than this. So this is the electional chart. You got Pisces rising. The ruler of the ascendant is Jupiter, which is exalted in Cancer in the fifth whole sign house in a day chart. Very well placed Jupiter, doing very good. It's in a mutual reception with the moon, which is in Pisces in the first whole sign house, and the moon itself is applying to a trine with Jupiter. So very good fifth house things going on in terms of fifth house things involving like pleasure, fun, games, hobbies, enjoyment. Also, things sometimes related to like children can come up, and other fifth house activities would be excellent for this chart. The thing it's not so good for with Mars in the ninth house is things involving travel, interaction with foreign places, sometimes things involving education or beliefs. I did some elections this month using Pisces with Mars in the ninth house, and I like inadvertently like angered people who had strongly held beliefs. So it was an interesting example of like what happens when Mars is in the ninth house in a day chart. So you do want to be a little careful about that. But other than that, this chart also takes advantage of the very final days of that applying Venus-Jupiter square, with Venus in Libra at 23 degrees applying to a square with Jupiter in Cancer in the fifth house. So that is my best election for the month. Did you look at the electional weather this month, Austin?
I did. I did. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. There are a
That is
few
a great
nice
way to put it.
moments. There are a few nice moments right at the beginning of the month, while Venus is still in Libra.
Mhm.
But those disappear pretty quickly. They disappear by the end of the first week.
That actually reminds me, I forgot to say there's a variant chart that day, which I will give to people in case they can't use the Pisces rising one. But the variant chart is Capricorn rising, which occurs in the middle of the day. Let's say early, at least in my location in Denver, we would probably want to stick with like early Capricorn rising. So put the ascendant early in Capricorn and try to get Venus on the midheaven there at 23 degrees of Libra. If you do that, you'll end up with a chart with Saturn ruling the ascendant. It's in the third house in a day chart. It has a nice trine from Jupiter. The moon and Jupiter are still in a mutual reception now between the third and seventh house of relationships, where we find the most positive planet in the chart in this instance. And then we put that Venus in Libra in the 10th whole sign house. So if people wanted an alternative or a variant time on the same day, you could also use this chart and also have some pretty good things about it. The only bad downside is that Mars then moves to the 11th house of friends and groups and alliances. So there could be some conflict or some strife or tension in that area where if what you're initiating is more focused on friends and groups, then I probably wouldn't recommend using this chart. But for other charts, if you're looking for other electional dates during the course of November, Lisa and I just released this month's episode of the Electional Astrology Podcast about a week ago. And you can find, I think, at least like 10 other charts that we found during the course of November for if not planning things, at least trying to plan around some of the most difficult combinations of the month and picking the best times to act given the otherwise kind of challenging astrological weather. So you can find out more about that at theastrologypodcast.com/elections or sign up on patreon.com/astrologypodcast. All right. So that is the electional weather, but that segues into the alignments for the beginning of the month. And we basically have to jump into that Mars-Uranus opposition because it's the first major thing. I mean, maybe I shouldn't open with that because the best thing that happens, you mentioned already, Austin, which is we get this lovely Venus-Jupiter square that happens at the very beginning of the month on November 1st and 2nd that does have a positive energy, especially if you have, let's say, anything around 24, 25 degrees of cardinal signs, right?
Yeah, and we could just say generally cardinal and especially late cardinal, right? The even though Venus's time in Libra did not prevent the the Mars and Scorpio things from happening, it did provide it did bring a number of pleasant things into being. The two benefics both being in great signs where they've got a lot of strength, offset a lot of the nastiness in October for the second half of October, and we have the last bits of that. Not the dregs, but like it's like the last couple scoops of or the last like couple bites of cake before it's gone during this first like 5 days ish of of November. And
I
so
like that. The last bites of cake. That's a good one.
yeah, then we have to confront the no more cake situation. And the cake, the fact that you had cake didn't keep your website from getting hacked. They're separate. The goods and the bads are sometimes separate, right? It's like, but do you want a hacked website and cake or a hacked website and no cake, right? Cake, please. And
Definitely. I am pro cake. I'm definitely pro cake,
pro cake. Uh,
especially tomorrow on my birthday, actually.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, um, and so yeah, we get a little bit more of that, and the moon in Aries on the second and third is configured is angular to both Venus and Jupiter. It's not the most splendid, magnificent configuration imaginable, but it's fun, it's peppy, and there's still cake, right? Cake is still being served until the 6th when Venus enters Scorpio. And so
Yeah. Until the fourth, let's say, because like fourth things get rocky from the
no,
fourth on.
well, the Mercury Mars will introduce more problems, but they will be problems that run concurrently with the serving of cake. Like it's not like Mercury and Mars attack Venus and Jupiter. They just create problems while cake is still being served. And depending on which side of that you're on, you might just be like, great, it's still cake for a few more days, or the issues that Mercury and Mars present may completely obfuscate the availability of treats.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. Is sometimes it's hard to eat cake when there's like explosions going on outside of your house or like a fire has just broken out or something like that.
Sure, but sometimes it's just irritating. Like the Mercury Mars is going to create problems for some people. It'll be a little bit of annoying over here, while a little bit of good happens over there. For some people, the Mercury Mars will certainly outweigh what cake remains.
For sure. All right. So moving into the non-cake portion, I will say that even once the cake of the Venus-Jupiter square ends by November 6th and Venus moves into Scorpio, something I'm looking forward to about that is that Venus will come in and clean up and counteract some of the mess I think that Mars made as it was going through Scorpio over the course of the past month, month and a half. So that's a nice era that will be beginning with that ingress of Venus into Scorpio on November 6th. And of course, simultaneously on November 4th, Mars is ingress into Sagittarius, where it opposes Uranus, will simultaneously be the departure of Mars from Scorpio, and therefore the removal of an irritant that's been in that sector of our charts for the past month and a half since whenever Mars went into Scorpio in late September. Actually, I remember that very
So
vividly when it went into Scorpio in September. You have the date?
yeah, it was basically a day after or it was the day of the equinox.
Yeah, I was thinking how it was like a day or two after the eclipse. About the second eclipse was on September 20th, I think, right?
It was on the eve of the equinox.
Got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I
So hold on. So
okay.
just emphasizing that point to everybody think about personally, because we saw this happen earlier this year when Mars went retrograde in Cancer, caused a lot of problems in the Cancer whole sign house in our chart. Then Jupiter came in and Venus as well at some point, and there, in some instances, was some positive cleaning up that occurred when the benefics moved through the sign that the malefics had recently went through and caused problems. So some of the experience this month with Venus going through Scorpio will be a positive counteraction of things, as well as Mars no longer being there. So it's a good thing to think about in terms of personal astrology.
Mars leaves Scorpio. And Mars causes problems in Scorpio, but for those that like a little Mars and that Scorpio is well placed, for like Mars and Scorpio can also be and was a powerful, as we say, motivator, stimulant, et cetera, et cetera. Although I didn't love all of the Mercury Mars, like I always get a lot done and I'm happy in retrospect with Mars's pass through Scorpio. And
Totally.
so to
Yeah, there's
whatever,
a like yeah, Iamblichus says that Mars, the energy of Mars, like in the celestial spheres, is that it drives and excites
Mhm.
life into action and creates movement and extreme forms of forward movement. And that in the sublunary spheres, sometimes this can be experienced as going to extremes, which can mean like going too fast or being jostled or jolted or even feelings of like burning or irritation, but that fundamentally in its most constructive form, it can just be working really hard and having a lot of forward movement. And yeah, that is a lot of what we saw in Scorpio. And then it will be bringing that energy now to the Sagittarius sectors of our chart.
And I like the term driven, right?
Mm,
Because when you're driven, there's a sense that it's not something you've chosen on a whim, that there's some reason why you're moving in a direction and potentially some consequence for not moving in that direction. Because even when Mars indicates a period of heroic accomplishment or badassery of some sort, there's the forces of necessity and consequence are very often present. It's not just something you kind of felt like doing and wasn't that fun, right? You're driven,
right.
right?
Yeah,
By
absolutely.
forces within or without. Um,
Yeah, I will say that like with Mars going through my 10th house, it was like the website was immediately destroyed as soon as Mars ingress, like literally that day. And then so there was like a burning down and a destruction of something, but then it forced me over the next month to work really hard on the website to create a new one and to rebuild it and to make it sort of like rise from the ashes as something new. So when people go there, you'll see it's a much different and much more simple layout at this point, but it's also, I like it. It's got new, better typography. It reads better. It looks better. It's faster. And the amount of energy that I put into constructing it was like a huge um, exertion for me, but it was I was also digging deep to find that energy and I found it and it was also a good feeling in terms of that. So I think that speaks to what you're talking about.
yeah, and because you had to, because the
Right.
consequence was, well, how about no website?
Right. How about everything ends, the astrology podcast and everything ends like right today. No, that was not, I was not done. I was not done with doing this podcast. We're going to get more than 500 episodes, hopefully.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. The struggle is real and will continue. Um, so Mars leaves Scorpio, right? And it enters Sagittarius. For me, one of the things about this, like as sort of as part of larger patterning, is that this brings Mercury and Mars back into the same sign because as we begin the month and as October ended, we had a brief respite where of Mars and Mercury being in the same sign. Mercury jumped into Sag before Mars could get there. There's about a week from like the 29th up until the 4th here when Mars enters Sagittarius, where there's no Mars Mercury co-presence, right, for just
Mm,
a little bit. And I experienced that and loved it yesterday when I had a lot of mercurial errands to run and nothing went crazy wrong. Because every time I've tried to do mercurial errands over much of the last month, there's always been a lot of additional difficulty being introduced because Mars Mercury. So
yeah.
that respite is over. And it's from the
Yes.
4th to the 18th. We've got Mars and Mercury back in the same sign.
Yeah, so it's only a very brief period, so we got to get into that now, which is that most of the experience of this month is going to be this intense Mars Mercury energy because um, from the fourth onward, the two of them are building up to another conjunction, basically, when Mercury slows down and stations retrograde on the ninth at 6 degrees of Sagittarius. Mars is at 3 degrees of Sagittarius. So Mars, a few days later, catches up to Mercury and conjoins it on the 12th and 13th. So we're going to get a whole other Mars Mercury conjunction like we experienced around October 19th and 20th, but this time with Mercury stationing retrograde. And like I said earlier, adding those additional Mercury retrograde themes of like miscommunication, delays, technical snafus, and other things like that on top of that conjunction, which is going to not be super pleasant. And it's also probably going to call back and mean that there's going to be a continuation of some of the Mars Mercury issues that started or happened in October that maybe you thought were finished are actually going to continue or return back into your life at this point around the time of the second conjunction, when it turns out that some of those things were not one-time events, but rather it was opening up a sequence of events that are going to play out during the course of especially this retrograde period.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, which might be frustrating and or unpleasant to hear if you got the worst or even half of the worst of the Mars Mercury during October. Worth noting, Chris, that in this chart that you have up now for November 12th for the second conjunction of Mercury Mars, the sun just happens to be in the degree that Mercury and Mars conjoined the first time. Just noticing that
Yeah.
now, just for shits, giggles, and bonus tidbits.
Well, that's a great point because that's the degree that Mercury is going to retrograde back to, because that was its shadow degree, and that's the degree it'll station direct at eventually about at 20 degrees of Scorpio around here at the end of the month, around November 28th and 29th. So for some reason, that 20-degree Scorpio period is super important and super active. And if it coincided with an event when Mercury and Mars first moved over that degree, then you can expect a return back to the events as part of a sequence by late November when Mercury goes back there and then stations direct at 20 Scorpio.
Yeah, and so I wonder if we should remember to keep an eye out for follow-ups on the Louvre heist, and
Hmm.
also to see if there are further developments with the Windows 11 rollout, as well as the AWS outage. If like these, like if those events in retrospect, were the beginning of something, of at least a short sequence that needed some time to play out. One
Right. And
thing,
the White House construction as
oh
well.
yeah,
That was the other big
yeah,
thing. And then there was also protests that happened around that times. The No Kings protests happened around that conjunction. So that could be something as well, because that obviously a protest archetypally fit the symbolism of Mercury and Mars. So maybe it's some other protests or other things like that that come up.
Right, yeah, giving speech Mercury, to anger descent Mars.
Right, right. Let me show that Mercury retrograde graphic again because we spent two things. Actually, I wanted to show. I made an infographic just for Mercury in general to make sure we state the standard Mercury retrograde things, which is, Mercury retrogrades happen 3 to 4 times a year when Mercury appears to move backwards in the sky for about 3 weeks, and that's what's happening most of November. There's communication challenges like delays, misunderstandings, and technical issues. It's a good time internally or personally for like review and reflection to reevaluate your plans and decisions, and especially to look back into your past and to revisit something, especially in the house or houses that Mercury retrogrades in, which in this case is going to be your whole sign Sagittarius house, as well as your whole sign Scorpio house. And then finally, during Mercury retrogrades, we always tell people to have patience and to be flexible and adaptable because you're going to get some curveballs during a Mercury retrograde that you don't expect that are going to throw your plans off, and you need to be able to adapt to that in order to deal with the curveballs the most gracefully. So here is the Mercury retrograde graphic again that Paige designed to help better illustrate this as like an astronomical phenomenon of kind of like the shape, roughly, like approximately, let's say, that you see in the sky, where way back here on October 6th, Mercury went into Scorpio, which is the sign it will later retrograde it back in. So that sets up the initial activation of that whole sign house of our chart. Then October 21st, it entered its shadow at 20 degrees of Scorpio. So that was, pay attention to any events that happened around that time because they're going to be returned to when Mercury returns. Mercury goes into Sag on October 29th, then it stations retrograde on November 9th in Sagittarius. We get the conjunction with Mars several days later, just after the station. Then Mercury goes back into Scorpio on the 18th and re-enters whatever whole sign house that is in your chart before eventually stationing direct at 20 degrees of Scorpio on the 29th. Then it goes back into Sag in December 11th, exits its shadow, and completes most of the retrograde stuff on December 16th, and then finally departs from Sagittarius entirely and completes the entire sign-based sequence by January 1st. So pretty good way of visualizing things, yeah?
Yeah, what's I think it's very descriptive of the experience of Mercury retrograde, to see that it's not just going back and forth, it's actually doing a roller coaster loop de loop
Right.
where things,
Yeah.
where if you were to ride that, you would feel upside down at certain points, and you can more easily imagine the G forces you were subject to during the acceleration and deceleration periods, right? Because
Right.
it's not merely that things are moving, it's that you are moving along with them, or you are on, as a moving train, but a train on a loop-de-loop track, on a track that has the dimension of height, right?
Right.
Because Mercury's retrogrades often feature disorientation, right,
Mhm.
as a key part of their experience. And so
Totally. That's a
knowing that that's literally what's happening makes a lot of sense.
That's a great point. And this is when it's right here when Mercury stations and then it begins that entire retrograde movement like here that entire period is like the most intense experience where you do have that, like you're saying, like imagining if you were on like a roller coaster, that's the point at which it starts like suddenly going upwards and then you're inverted when Mercury is actually retrograde between November 9th and November 29th before it stations direct. And then eventually things start resuming that forward movement again.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so it's a great visualization.
Yeah, so shout out for to Paige for making that for us. And um, what was I going to say? There was a final thing about Mercury retrograde, which is just maybe that's good. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. So let's go back to the chart though, because we're skipping that really important aspect that starts fundamentally the month off with. Even though we have a nice few days at the beginning, um, this Mars-Uranus opposition that goes exact around November 3rd, 4th, and 5th is particularly tense and explosive. And we need to make sure we give adequate treatment to that because the last several like Mars-Uranus hard aspects have been pretty rough and pretty crazy. The most recent one was the one that happened in June. Remember when Mars was moving through Leo and it squared Uranus and Taurus? And that was like that crazy weekend when like the first No Kings protests happened and like there was the war with Iran started around that time, and there was like two or three other things that were like popping off all around that Mars-Uranus square, remember?
Oh yes. Yeah, I mean, Mars and Uranus, like, to bring it back to an hour ago, right? What were we deeply concerned about in terms of the nuclear fate of the world? Oh, it was a Mars.
Right.
It was a series of Mars Uranus conjunctions. Like Mars Uranus um, blows shit up, and it can do that in a positive way. Sometimes it's there's like how should I say it? Like fantastical like achievement that breaks boundaries and that you didn't know was possible. But the level of energy that you often have with Mars Uranus, this like boundary bursting, boundary bursting, precedent ignoring, straightforward assertion, right? To just stitch together some keywords. There's not a lot that can hold that without getting damaged, and so it can be extraordinarily positive, but very often it's destructive, right? Whether that's the intention or not. Like because it both, Mars is inherently aggressive and willing to would rather cut through than go around, and Uranus intensifies that sort of contentiousness to an extreme degree. And so, yeah, it's hard to find a container that isn't damaged by Mars Uranus configurations.
Right, because Mars has this inherent severing and separating quality, which can be used constructively. Like you need to cut into something during surgery, for example, but severing and separation is oftentimes experienced by us as something that's traumatic, where you're like ripping something apart for some reason, or something is getting torn apart, like let's say a relationship separating or two countries going to war or what have you. So it's, Mars is also traditionally the planet of war and conflict. And then it's opposing Uranus, which is this energy of unexpected disruptions and sudden rapid changes is the primary indication of Uranus. And so when you put those two energies together, especially by putting them in an opposition, which is a naturally discordant energy, when you put two planets on as like far ends of the spectrum as you possibly can from each other, so that they have opposing priorities and orientations to what they're trying to do and accomplish. It creates a tension between those two energies that's hard to reconcile and oftentimes can be experienced as sudden upsets and difficulties and conflicts and strife and other things like that.
Yeah, yeah, and with the Uranus gives it a very out of the blue quality.
Hmm.
Like, oh, I didn't even know we were having a fight about that. I didn't know that that was so important to you, right? Uranus crosses or ignores previously established boundaries, right? So, like an
Yeah.
act of aggression or assertion that ignores previous agreements or ignores boundaries that had become the norm.
Right. Yeah. So this will actually also be, I realize now, our first Mars-Uranus opposition in Gemini. So this is going to be an important aspect to pay attention to historically, because whatever events or dynamics arise at this time in the news, especially in a few days around November 4th, we'll probably see recurrences of those same dynamics or energies or even news stories over the course of the next like 7 years as we have probably three or four more of these oppositions take place between Sagittarius and Gemini. And that's also activating a much different axis in our chart than Mars-Uranus oppositions have been for the past 7 or 8 years, where they've been taking place between Taurus and Scorpio. So we're not going to be quite accustomed to dealing with those unexpected disruptions and that type of energy taking place in those whole sign houses in our chart and that axis.
Yeah, and so to speak to that, with Uranus having spent the most of the last 7 years in Taurus, um, Taurus is slower, it's more substantial. There's more, how should I say, things are solid and accumulated and have mass. In Gemini and then in Sagittarius, which is opposite it, we have things move much faster. They tend to move in multiples rather than singular heavy things. And there's a general, how should we say, there's a general capacity for speed and the chaos born of things, many things moving quickly in these mutable signs that we don't see as much with the fixed signs where Uranus has been and where Mars has opposed Uranus since 2018.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we open with that sort of explosive, tense energy right away on November 4th, and that's like our introduction to Mars and Sagittarius. Um, so it starts moving away from that opposition over the next few days, and we get our first lunation of the month, which is that full moon in Taurus the very next day on November 5th in Taurus. And so it still has that Mars-Uranus opposition very, very close and very, very pronounced at a time when the sort of heightened, sometimes not just tensions, but heightened energy of a full moon is taking place at the same time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we have some counterpoints to that, like jagged, non-conciliatory Mars-Uranus energy. It's the full moon in Taurus, which is the place of exaltation for the moon. And the moon exalts in Taurus because it stabilizes the sometimes too quick flow, the too quick waxing and waning and this and that of the moon. It like stabilizes, it helps create some security. And we have at that point in time and for not much longer, we still have Venus in Libra. So they, again, the forces of reconciliation, stabilization, and peace are strong. And the applying aspect from the moon after it leaves perfect opposition and fullness with the sun is a sextile with an exalted Jupiter in Cancer, right? And so we have this one last sort of gasp of double benefic, stabilizing, maybe it's not so bad energy, while this next round of destabilizing, line crossing, quick, fast, confusing, and aggressive starts up. And this is really the last gasp of the double benefic stabilizing energy. So it's interesting that these sort of cross paths. We get one last nice while the new mean introduces itself.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and it bakes that into that full moon, which then that lunation is sort of effective for the next couple of weeks, and something about that energy then carries forward. So after that time, Venus goes into Scorpio, as we said, on November 6th and 7th, and begins cleaning up some of the mess that Mars left behind there, which is kind of positive. And eventually, later on, Venus will move into and form a trine with Jupiter and Saturn, which will be an awesome aspect that will take place around the time that Mercury's like stationing direct there. So there's a lot of actually positive resolution type energy, positive resolution type energy later in November around the time of, let's say, we have this Mercury-Venus conjunction on November 24th. We have Venus trining Jupiter exactly on November 26th, Venus trining Saturn around the same time, and then Mercury stationing direct on the 28th and 29th. So, at least in terms of that stuff, I like how Venus's entry into Scorpio earlier in the month builds up to and eventually culminates with coming in to really help out Mercury as it's returning and retracing its steps in Scorpio, but then finally starting to move forward again and pick up the pieces and um, yeah, build things back up again stronger.
Yeah, Venus does some nice things during the last portion of the month. I don't think it'll be much help during the beginning of the month, though.
Sure, right. All right, so going back,
So the day after Venus enters Scorpio, we get a very important regress. Uranus Uranus
uh,
ends this preview period in Gemini and returns to Taurus for almost 6 months. It's going to be the end. It's going to be April 25th before Uranus is back in Gemini, and then
wow.
on April 25th, 2026, Uranus returns to Gemini and will be there until 2032, and then a little bit more then into Cancer, then a little bit more in 2033, and then done for good. But this this is the what we begin on the 7th is the last portion, the wrap up, the epilogue um, of the Uranus in Taurus story. And not only is that significant in and of itself, but it also begins this strange period in which we finish the year in which Saturn is back in Pisces, just like it was at the beginning of the year. Neptune's back in Pisces, just like it was in the beginning of the year. And Uranus is in Taurus, just like it was in the beginning of the year. Whereas for a chunk of 2025, we saw all three of these outer planets in new signs. And what we saw, especially during the third quarter of the year, was the positions that those planets will hold for several years to come. For Uranus, 7 years, for Neptune, 14, and for Saturn, 2.5. But we're sort of weirdly back to where the year began once Uranus moves back into Taurus. And so there's a strange quality of so much has happened, and yet the vibes are going to be eerily similar to how we began, and yet they can't be, right? Like we're back to being on the precipice of this um was it brave new world rather than being in this brave new world, which we got a taste of this year. It's a very strange thing. It's something we remarked on in the yearly and have remarked on throughout the year.
Right. Yeah, we got a heavy taste of what Uranus and Gemini is going to be about over the past several months since it went in July, and especially when it stationed retrograde in Gemini for the first time at the beginning of September. But now we've got it going back into Taurus and going back to that transit that many of us have been experiencing in different sectors of our chart, different whole sign houses, especially since 2018 and 2019. And what's funny, you and I both know like I know a Taurus rising in my personal life who Uranus went into Taurus into their rising sign and they immediately wanted to change things in their life and start making major moves, and they packed up all their bags and moved to like a different part of the country to like live out their ideal living situation scenario. But I've been noticing as that transit's like winding down that they almost like went through that and had that liberatory experience and achieved new levels in terms of that, but almost feel like they're bringing that to completion and maybe might return back to where they started in some way. And that's like a very literal example, but there's something broadly about that I think we're all experiencing with Uranus in whatever house it went through in our chart and the major changes and radical changes and sometimes upsets in that part of our life, and how we finally saw that winding down over the summer with the removal of that energy, but there's something left that needs to be finished there over the next several months between now and April as Uranus goes back into that sign. And that'll become really pronounced when Uranus stations in Taurus, and we'll get the final message about what that was all about. Do you know when that station is by chance?
Ooh, I don't.
Okay, actually,
Between November 7th and April 25th.
well, it's right here. It's 87 days from November 7th. So that's approximately, they'll station direct at 27 degrees of Taurus. I could just stop being lazy and like animate the chart. Here it is. So it's like, oh, if only there was a way to know. I'm like sitting in front of an astrology program. There it is. So February 3rd, Uranus stations direct at 27 degrees of Taurus. So that will be the final exclamation mark, the final like speech that Uranus really has to give about what that transit is about and what major radical changes and liberatory experiences in some instances that we all had to have in that area of our life, that house that Uranus is transiting before it makes its way out in, you said April?
April 25th.
Got it. Okay. All right. So a return back to that Uranus in Taurus energy is very important. We've talked about that as like the financial stuff over the years. Obviously, like crypto, Bitcoin, all of those things have had radical changes since 2018, 2019 in terms of the bizarrely quick mass adoption that's taken place, especially in the past year, where suddenly that's being advocated by the government and being normalized in different ways. So I'm sure there's going to be some final things going on there. The financial and monetary systems and the conversions to digital currencies that we've seen. But also, I mean, we'll see about the potential, like disruptive potential of some of that, since that's also been a potential bubble or something that's been there over the course of the past year in terms of how much money is being put into crypto. And then a year ago, we were also talking about like BRICS and whether the US dollar remains the primary like world reserve currency and the efforts to move away from that by different countries. There's a lot of things that I think this final transit of Uranus and Taurus is going to bring about, not just personally, but also in terms of world events and world astrology.
Yeah. Currency in general, whether it's crypto or otherwise, is a big part of Uranus's historical journeys through Taurus. It changes currencies and what holds value, et cetera, et cetera. To speak to the point you were making about personal journeys of what Uranus has wrought over the last 7 years. That you make a really good point about it being time to do the last part of it, which might be the integrating of it. What did I learn? What did I learn on my journey into the wild in whatever sense?
Mm,
Like I sought independence and empowerment and who I am and what I am apart from my previous context, because that's Uranus is about the principle of individuality, but in a more extreme sense, where it is individuality with as little with as little interfering context as possible, right? When nothing constrains me, what choices would I make? Right, rather than what
yeah.
practical choices do I make given the many constraints and commitments. And so it is that this does
It's like a
begin.
rebellious teenager energy.
Yeah, it can be like there are mature and silly versions of it. But it's certainly it's the seeking who am I really, when I'm not arguing with my parents, right? So I'm going to move away from my parents, and then who am I when I don't have to argue with anybody? And that can be very positive. And so we have the wrapping up of that, but then for people who have should I say positions in mutable signs or in Gemini who got a taste of that Uranus, right? This is a step back from it, a chance to reflect on what impetus, like what fires have been lit to seek independence, autonomy, empowerment, apartness, innovation. Like what fires got lit to do that over the summer, right? Like we're from
Mm.
July until literally now. Like what new what should we say, what new fool's journeys are starting to be tempting, right? Because this is sort of a step back into where we've been, but this is also where the seeds of the next round of those begin sprouting invisibly.
Definitely. Yeah, and we're going to see some crucial check-ins in that when Mercury, for example, is going to retrograde back into late Scorpio and oppose Uranus. So, for example, on November 18th, and that just happens to be very close to within a day of our second lunation of the month, which is this new moon in Scorpio that takes place on the 19th, while Mercury's opposing Uranus and Taurus. And then later, Venus will oppose Uranus on the very final days of the month, especially on November 29th. We'll have a Venus at 29 degrees of Scorpio opposing Uranus at 29 Taurus while Mercury's stationing direct. So those will be two especially key moments of checking in on that final Uranus transit that will happen this month.
Yeah, and I think that's worth further emphasizing. So this movement back into of Uranus back into Taurus does not go unnoticed. It gets hammered. It gets hammered this month, right? The So as soon as Mercury retrogrades back out of Sagittarius and into Scorpio, immediately Mercury makes an opposition with Uranus, and that opposition with Uranus is supported by the fact that there is a new moon. The sun and moon are conjoined Mercury as it makes that opposition, meaning that
Mhm.
the sun, moon, and Mercury all oppose and spotlight Uranus back in Taurus. And
Right.
because three times is the rule for Mercury retrograde. As you said, there's another Mercury Uranus opposition further along when Mercury is direct. And so this is not like this like wrapping up, reflecting on, experiencing the last chapter of the Uranus and Taurus story is not will not be subtle, and you will not wait months to experience that. It's part of the DNA of this month.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it basically is the signature aspect for that second lunation of the month, which is the new moon on November 19th at 28 degrees of Scorpio, conjunct Mercury, exactly opposite Uranus, only a degree off at 29 degrees of Taurus. And that's interesting because since this is also the Mercury retrograde cazimi, when Mercury makes its retrograde conjunction with the sun, that's exactly halfway through the Mercury retrograde cycle. And typically, what we see is that's the point when you start to see some glimmer of hope or glimmer of resolution to the problems that the Mercury retrograde set up at the beginning when it first stationed. You usually start to see a shift towards resolution at this point. But there's something surprising or something unexpected that happens around that time that comes through that opposition.
Yeah, that Mercury Sun conjunction is sort of it's the pathfinding moment of okay, this is how I get through this. This is how I navigate these obstacles. This is how I negate them. And so there's either something occurs right with Uranus that changes the landscape and changes what course we're going to take out of this web of the confusions, or the answer, like the pathfinding answer, is a revelatory or unexpected or deeply unorthodox one, right? Like the way to win
Right.
the game is to stop playing, right? Like some sort of Uranus gives like galaxy brain moments, both
Right.
fake and real, and it's hard to tell the
Yeah.
difference sometimes.
Of like you can win the game by just like throwing the entire board game off the table.
Yeah, yeah, or just unplugging Nintendo.
Right. That's a good move. Classic move when you're losing like GoldenEye, just unplug the Nintendo.
You
Um,
throw the controller hard enough that it yanks the whole system out of the wall.
okay. No, that's how you get punched, my friend. If you're playing games over at our house as a teenager.
The
One of the things I
astrology
like
of rage quitting.
rage quitting. That would be a good title for this month, actually, and for several reasons.
Uh-huh.
So one of the things I really like about this new moon, though, aside from the unexpectedness and the disruption of the Uranus opposition, is this new moon at 28 Scorpio has this nice trine with Jupiter, which is slowing down, which has stationed actually just a week earlier. It's stationed 8 days earlier, and it has this nice trine with Saturn. So there's like some supportive aspects with the lunation that are bringing in a constructive element, both in a Jupiterian sort of expansive sense, but also in a more conservative, but like making slow, steady progress type Saturnian theme as well.
Yeah. And it brings a lot of it gives the it gives the questions it gives Mercury's pathfinding questions a lot of weight because so many important planets are configured to it. Like we're looking at navigating not just like a little like a circumstance that just formed up really quickly, but like the circumstance which is created um, collectively between Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, little bit of North Node, and the Sun and the Moon and Mercury and Uranus, right? Like it's taking in a lot, right? It's how do I navigate like these seas? Like there are very few planets left out of this, honestly.
Right. Yeah.
Some larger, deeper questions about how to make our way through this in a
Right.
way that achieves our aims, it minimizes suffering, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. All right. So I want to jump into the two stations this month.
Hmm.
One of the stations is Jupiter stationing retrograde at 25 degrees of Cancer around November 10th, 11th, and 12th. So this is going to be, again, a station is like an exclamation mark next to this transit that Jupiter has been making ever since it moved into Cancer earlier this year. Suddenly we reach a crucial turning point with respect to that. And for some people, like if you have a degree that's active in your chart around 25 degrees of certain signs, like especially Cancer, that could be really positive transit that you're happening because you have Jupiter just slowing down and camping out at that degree for several weeks, which could be experienced as a extended positive energy that's bringing in like balance and abundance and other things into your life. So that's one of the aspects that's decent this month. And then the other one is Saturn's station in Pisces. And this one's to me, actually, one of the most important aspects this month, just because I think this is um, leading us to the final resolution of a lot of the challenges and a lot of the, in some instances, setbacks, but in other instances, lessons that we've been learning since Saturn started moving through the Pisces sector of our chart in March of 2023. So I want everybody to think about what major changes started happening in your life in March of 2023, especially that match whatever whole sign house Pisces coincides with in your chart. And in some instances, it may just be things of like having greater responsibility or taking on bigger duties in that area of your life. In other instances, there may have been challenges that started to arise or setbacks that started to arise in that area of your life that caused you to have to negate something or to get rid of something, or where you were proceeding on a certain path, but life and fate said no, that you can't proceed further on that path and you have to go a different direction or you have to do something else. We had a temporary departure and alleviation of that energy for most of the past several months that Saturn was initially in Aries for a little bit there this year. But at the beginning of September, Saturn came back to Pisces, and I saw a bunch of people suddenly having to return back to something that they'd been putting a lot of work into and sort of wrestling with over the past 2.5 years since March of 2023. And I think this station here is important for a lot of people. It's going to be important for a lot of people in late November because it's going to be one of the final turning points in order to bring resolution to that sequence of events that's been happening for 2.5 years. And Saturn's going to get some help from the other planets this month because it has that nice trine from Jupiter while it's stationing. It has that nice trine from Venus in Scorpio, and it has that nice trine from Mercury stationing direct at 20 degrees of Scorpio at the same time. So there's just some positive like resolution of those Saturnian transit issues is in store for us around that time, and that's something I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out for many people.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good description, and you make a good point that at the time of that, at the time of Saturn's direct station, it's configured to both benefics, which pulls in help from both Jupiter and Venus for making that that march through the final march through those last degrees of Pisces. And
Right. Friends, help, allies are good trine keywords.
yeah, as well as inspiration, right? Like simply being inspired to do the thing is a very different state than being depressed and avoidant about doing the thing. And like seeing that by doing the like this is the way forward. This has meaning and has great benefit, rather than just resentfully resentfully putting one foot in front of the other. And that there with Venus there are like some quiet joys to be found in this. um
Yeah. Or like, for a lot of people, a lot of the responsibilities and the things they've been working on in the Pisces sector of their life over the past 2.5 years, in many instances, it's been burdens that they've had to carry on their shoulders alone. But this might be a good time to ask for help or to get or receive help in that area that you've been working on over the past 2.5 years. And that may be the key to finally moving forward and putting that era of your life behind you, is reaching out for help around that time.
that's a nice thought. Yeah. The time frame for me is really obvious. It was shortly after this that Kate became pregnant with Lucian, and then Lucian was born, I don't know, like a week or two before Saturn conjoined my son exactly in Pisces.
Mm,
And so just the increase of responsibility and learning how to do my meet my responsibilities that pre-existed being a father, as well as meeting the responsibilities of being a father, and the change responsibilities of not just being a husband but also being a co-parent, has timed really tightly with Saturn in the same sign as my sect light. um, and
yeah, that's
upon
perfect also because now it's like you're a year and a half into that journey, and some of the things that you're experiencing earlier in it, like the sleeplessness and other things like that, are reaching some alleviation.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it's definitely easier than it was, 6 months ago or 12 months ago.
Right.
And so, upon reflection, I get I was going to say some really cliched but useful Saturnian themes. It's like, oh, learning to bear greater responsibility with some measure of grace, right?
Mhm.
And then another thing that I can see both in myself as well as other people with this Saturn and Pisces period is how to find or create some structure or order, even though life does not provide it. Like how to, how to create and, dare I say, cling to some skeleton of order, even when life in the world is chaotic. Right, Pisces, especially with Neptune, there is not a particularly orderly place, and so figuring out how to keep some schedule, how to, whether it's work, diet, social life, et cetera, like how to maintain some good and supportive order, despite a chaotic or unpredictable environment is a real is a real skill that comes out of meeting that challenge. And I know a number of people have had that challenge with Saturn's time in Pisces.
Definitely, definitely. Um, all right. And then, of course, we've got Neptune there very closely as well, although Saturn and Neptune are a little bit further away from the super close conjunction that they had over the summer. Um, but that energy is still very potent. And now it's not just Saturn, but also Neptune that's back in Pisces at this time for another trip.
Yep, until the end of January.
Okay. Yeah, that conjunction is going to be wild when we get, because we didn't get it in July.
Mm-mm.
They got super close within less than a degree, but they didn't exactly conjoin. So we are still waiting to see what that exact conjunction is going to look like in Aries in early next year.
Yeah, February 19th, I believe. Neptune's back at the in Aries at the end of January. Saturn goes back into Aries on February 13th, and they finally kiss on February 19th.
That reminds me, a year ago, last year we saw like, the first Saturn station in Pisces was like the Titan submarine disaster. But last year, the two stations, there were things about old age and like people hitting their limits. Like the first one was like when Saturn stationed retrograde in Pisces was Biden's debate performance,
Hmm.
where it became really clear that he was too old to be running for office, and that was the beginning of the end of his candidacy. And then the second station later that year, if you remember, was that Mike Tyson fight, where it was like that fight where it was kind of hard to watch because he was much older and he was fighting a much younger guy and he's just kind of getting pummeled. So some themes surrounding that of like issues in terms of mundane astrology of like age and reaching limits and recognizing boundaries and limitations that maybe previously you hadn't or you'd refused to recognize or been unwilling to come to terms with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, honestly, when I look around at the world, I see a lot of structures that are weakened and decayed and cannot possibly endured, yet they're still here, and the consequences of their collapse are unpleasant to think about. And so there's a lot of like, well, this can't possibly continue. Like this has to change. Should have this should have been addressed 5 or 10 years ago, but now we're here with the even more rotted out version of what it is. And so it contributes to that feeling of living in a structurally unsound house and being paranoid as to which sections will collapse and how dramatically and when.
Totally. That's an amazing way of phrasing that. And the just structural weakness, because I think that's a great keyword for Saturn-Neptune conjunction. But also that then ties back in with the bubbles and this question of like
Hmm.
Saturn Neptune is also bubbles, and like when do bubbles pop is sometimes when there's like a needle that comes along and pierces through it, and that is kind of the thing we see on the horizon there by the time we get to late November as well, as we see Mars passing through mid Sagittarius and getting ready to move into the third decan, at which point it's coming up pretty fast on a square with Saturn in December, as well as a square with Neptune. And with all the talk about like the bubble and like when will the bubble pop and everything, when I was looking at the astrology, and you and I were talking about this and looking at the astrology, this was one of the times that stood out to me. And I think that both of us of like a potential bubble popping energy is around this time. It looks like what, December 8th, December 9th, and the days surrounding that is the Saturn Mars square, the Mars Saturn square, and then Mars squares Neptune a few days later on December 14th. So that's an energy that, really begins building at the beginning of the month on November 4th, as soon as Mars goes into Sagittarius, because it begins its sign-based square with Saturn and Neptune at that point. But the energy is going to increase and increase and gather steam and intensity until it eventually culminates in December, especially in early to mid-December.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. yeah, it's like what, yeah, like if you know that there are if they're fragile structures that can't bear a stress test, then like where are the stress points? And that's definitely one of the stress points. And as we talked about, it just so happens that Mars squaring Saturn also coincides with Mercury's third and final opposition to Uranus, which also, Uranus gives destabilizing. And yeah, in addition to
It, it's
the
weird
image
that
of
we have like a positive affirming, so much positive affirming transits for Saturn station around November, 24th, 26th, 27th, 28th, when Saturn is stationing, and it's like trine Jupiter, and Mercury and Venus are trine Saturn. So there's like a positive affirmation of that Saturn there, as being a turning point, but in a good way. But then we get the other side of that, which is, as you said, the stress test a few weeks later that comes in the first and second week of December. So those are going to be very distinct energies that we're going to see play out over the course of the next, 6 weeks here,
yeah.
when we get the good side of Saturn stationing in Pisces and how we're experiencing that collectively in mundane astrology as well as personally. And then we're going to get the shaking up of that and seeing what parts of that structure still stand after the shaking is done in the first and second weeks of December.
Yeah, yeah, and one useful way to think about that might be what on a personal level like can be fortified with Saturn's direct station, with both
Mm,
benefics attending. Like what parts of
that's
my
good.
life don't need to be a bubble, but if I ignore them and just wait for something to go wrong, there might be some collapse. But like,
Right.
what can I fortify? What can I shore up?
That's
And
good. Having that
I
moment of clarity of like, this is the thing I need to work on, and this is the time to put the sandbags in around it, or to firm up the foundations in preparation, knowing that some unevenness and shakiness of the ground is coming up and is just weeks away.
Right. Yeah. 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 And it being Halloween, I can't not think of rotten pumpkins for structural weakness, right? Like as a pumpkin, I don't know, um, the way I grew up, is people carve pumpkins and they'd leave them out on Halloween, and a lot of them would just get left on, would get left around. And so a pumpkin, even super rotten, will hold its shape for a really long time if nobody touches it. But once it's rotten enough, it takes very little for it to just smoosh, right? And so, bubble popping is one way to think about structural weakness that can't take a stress test. I would also, it being the season, advise people to use rotten pumpkin analogy.
That's good. I like the word smoosh is a good Saturn, Neptune, Mars square keyword. Yeah. All right. That's really the astrology that's set up by the end of the month. That really brings us to the end of our forecast, because it's like we have that Mercury stationing direct, we have Saturn stationing direct at the end of the month, but then we have the stress test on the horizon that doesn't really fully come into effect until early December, and that's kind of where we leave November at the end of the month.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that November ends on a more how should we say, a more clear this is the way forward, at least for now, note, because we have not only that direct station of Saturn, but Mercury's direct station comes a day after that.
Hmm.
And they're in a trine configuration. You may not love, you may or may not love the lay of the land, but like we've done a lot. We've done a lot of backward. We've seen some things, and it's sort of time to plot a way forward, at least for the next bit. And it's much less confusing, I would say, than the second and third weeks of the month, where Mercury's going backwards, and there's Uranus, and there's Mars, and we are in the upside down portion of the roller coaster, right? We're still on the roller coaster, but we're in the right side up phase by the end of the month, and Saturn has also begun a grim but certain march forward.
Yeah, I appreciate the clarity that we're going to start feeling of coming out of the Mercury retrograde and being out of the loop and being not inverted again. And therefore, some of the like miscommunications and delays and technical snafus starting to be fully resolved as Mercury moves forward again. And yeah, having that clarity with the trine with Saturn at the same time, as well as the trine with Jupiter. So, yeah, there's some good stuff by the end of the month, but we got some stuff we got to get through that's going to be a little tricky, not going to lie, with the Mercury retrograde and conjunct Mars and other stuff like that, the Mars-Uranus opposition, etc., as we've talked about. But I think we've pretty much covered it as extensively as we can in terms of trying to describe some of the symbolism of what's coming up in the astrology of November. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, yeah. Always,
Yeah.
always fun. Always fun to map it out, make our guesses as to what it's going to look and feel like, and then get to see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's important. The I mentioned the prediction I had made about Uranus and like nuclear weapons on the year ahead forecast, and then how that kind of started coming true the day that Mercury opposed Uranus in Gemini. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is not just like to take credit or something, but to show how astrological predictions are done. And I saw some astrologer recently that didn't seem to understand that, or somebody that didn't understand that astrologers look at celestial phenomenon and the movement of the celestial bodies, and then they interpret those movements symbolically. And on some level, that's the divinatory element of astrology in terms of what we're doing and in terms of how we make astrological predictions. And one of the things you and I try to do really as well as we can is to ground our astrological predictions in the actual movements of the planets and in grounding it in either like recurrences of past transits that we've seen or other empirical observations like that. But that's really how we make predictions as astrologers is by interpreting symbolism and interpreting the planetary movements symbolically, like Mercury being the planet of communication that's associated with communication and it going retrograde. And symbolically, it's just moving backwards in the sky from our perspective as an observer, which sometimes skeptics will point out and say, well, that's just an optical illusion. But that's actually the key thing for astrologers in interpreting things symbolically is that it actually matters from the perspective of the observer what's happening in the sky and that does have symbolic import. And it's just such a key thing that people need to understand about astrology in general, but also in making mundane predictions like we do is we're doing our best to interpret the symbolism as accurately and as close to we can get it. But that's like it's a process and it's a skill that you have to develop. And it's interesting, seeing our progression over the years and where we've come to today and in our ability to do that.
Yeah, and as you said, it's a dialogue with facts, right? Like there is the planet's motions and configurations with each other give a how should we say a range of possibilities and topics that you then narrow down through study, and then you look at how that what things that are possible might match that, and that that is massively informed and strengthened and made more accurate by recourse to past instances, because that's one of the, how should we say, like that's a core part of astrology is the cyclical understanding of events. Just
Right.
like, after day follows night, and once and then again and again and again, when Mars goes through this part of the sky, these things keep happening. When Mars and Saturn are together, we get these kinds of things. And
Right.
so
Or,
to
or like
draw,
with Uranus, it's like noticing that Uranus, when Uranus was in Gemini the first time, or the first time it was in the Revolutionary War, and then 84 years later it was in the Civil War, and then 84 years later it was in World War II, and so now 84 years later we are in whatever we're about to be in, or how in my prediction, I was like, well, what was one of the major events that happened last time Uranus was in Gemini? And it was like, well, the atomic era started and nuclear weapons and energy came up. So therefore, that may become prominent again this time. And like an actual paying attention to and predicting things based on a repetition of celestial movements.
Yeah, exactly. And so if we're doing that again, what does it look like this time? Right. And what else? What's
Right.
the same and what's different? Um,
It's funny what a breadth of like history you have to study both in world events but also in personal events in order to be able to pull that off by being able to know like well what happened last time those repetitions occurred.
yeah, absolutely. And it's so valuable to understand what happened last time this happened for me as a person. Um,
Right.
which doesn't work with Uranus, right? Doesn't work with Neptune, doesn't work with Pluto, but for some of the more swiftly moving planets with Mars, you've seen Mars in every sign, every sign of the zodiac every 2 years for your whole life. You're like, oh, I don't know, Mars is going to conjoin my moon. It freaks me out. You've done, I don't know, 15, 20 of those. Just see what
Right. I
happens.
was I was thinking that with Mars conjoining my Mercury, because that transit always historically sucks for me in my 10th house, like ruling my lot of fortune. And I knew that weekend was going to suck. And indeed, it did suck. But I was like meditating on that before the transit happened of like knowing and what is the point of knowing and what can you do when you know that and what can you also do given the range of possible manifestations and the fact that it is a range rather than a super narrow one. There's a lot of interesting things to reflect on there in terms of that and the value of astrological prediction.
Right. Or yeah, and which is yeah, kind of like can tumble into the whole the gigantic question of foresight and like what is sometimes in stories the curse of foresight and then sometimes what is just simple and useful. And so I knew there was going to be trouble, so I made this decision. It wasn't as much trouble, but that's not always the case, right? There's the being trapped in prophecy storyline, which is
Mhm.
also true.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that is more and more relevant the longer I'm an astrologer. But then, of course, there's also sometimes the value to knowing when not to act or when to withhold action or when to know. I was thinking like last night of like looking at a chart, like if I make an action at this point, it's going to lead to conflict, and that sometimes the best move is not to play. And I think that can be valuable sometimes in knowing the astrology and knowing sometimes when not to act.
Absolutely, especially with Mars transits, which by their nature provoke a reaction that wants to turn into action.
Hmm.
Whereas sometimes Mars gets you by provoking you into action.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. I want to keep talking about this all day, but we've already gone my 2 hour limit. Of course, you and I get gabbing together, and
I
all of a
know.
sudden we've been talking for 2.5 hours. So unfortunately, I will have to bring this conversation to an end so that I am in one piece and can still celebrate my birthday tomorrow. What do you have going on? What are you working on this month? What's coming up?
So I'm teaching classes. Um, I'm mostly teaching classes, working on writing projects when I can. Um, Doing electional work for Sphere and Sundry. One of the projects that I elected is going to come out. I don't know, first 10 days of the month, and this is a decanic series. It is anchored to the third decan of Leo, um, which let's see, what I wrote about it 10 years ago was something like within it, one can find courage in the face of daunting odds, summon ferocity within and without, and rouse and rally others to a cause. The banner that flies over the third decan of Leo conjures hunger, power, and purpose. What good or evil that flag will accomplish when waved is, however, entirely dependent upon the hand that rests upon it. So,
That's beautiful. That's
thank you.
beautiful. You should have you
Um,
written that? Do you consider you should publish that somewhere? Have you considered
thanks.
perhaps publishing a book, Deckens?
Yeah, I'm considering it. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, Leo 3 is great. It's super, it's fiery, it's exciting. It's about arousing the animal spirits within and without. It's for conjuring inspiration, purpose, and hunger. It's really good for getting yourself and other people excited about things. I dare say it's actually really useful for marketing. As loath as I am to acknowledge the dire science of promotion, it's good for that. It's good for a lot of things. So that'll be that series launches um, again, like within the first 10 days of November, maybe the 6th, maybe the 7th, we'll see. But yeah, I'm just working on my stuff. I did realize, much to my chagrin, that something good, something nice did happen in my sphere during the end of October, during the nice Venusian part. Kate, at long last, launched her perfume project, which is called L'Etoile, or the star, as it were. And so there's you can check out L'Etoile perfume. Kate's been working with scent for a really long time with Sphere and Sundry, and got inspired earlier this year to just work with scent itself without having to wake up at 2:45 in the morning to catch Venus at a particular time in order to work with scent. And so I would suggest people check that out. It's letoileparfum.com.
Nice.
And next time you see me,
Scent
Chris, I'm gonna smell good.
flowery. Scent and perfumes are underrated signification of Venus that's
Hmm.
sometimes not recognized well enough.
Well, yeah, scent is so subtle, right? Because it's generally in the background, but it changes your interpretation. Like if you walk into a room and it just smells a little bit rotten or funky, like it makes you think of decay and look for every every it makes you look for mold in the corners or spider webs. Where if something smells good, it just changes, it like half consciously changes the way that we frame our experience.
Right. Yeah,
So
absolutely. Or when
again, next
something
time you
smells
smell me,
good,
the experience of Austin is going to be framed very differently.
I mean, when I smell you, it's always a good experience, Austin. So I don't know. Like when you smell something good, it brings back a positive memory from the past. That's one of the things oftentimes we experience during like the holiday season, for example, is like smells that sometimes invoke a range of emotions and feelings from the last time we smelled that.
Yeah, it's like just as a scent fills a space, like a scent can take you back to being in that space, right? Whether, yeah, it's holidays or the last time we embraced. Right.
No,
So
sorry,
no, it's good. We
all
don't need
right.
to dwell upon my scent and its upgrade. So my astrology stuff is austincoppock.com. Sphere and Sundry is sphereandsundry.com. And L'Etoile Parfum is l'etoileparfum.com. LETOILEPRPARFUM.com.
Brilliant. All right. Cool. As for myself, the holidays are coming up, and one of the things that's always funny during the holidays is I often see like a spike in sales of my book, Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune, and I often realize in retrospect that it's because a bunch of people were like buying the book for their astrology enthusiast family member or friend or what ha have you for the holidays. So I wanted to put that out there that the book is actually a great gift. If you are listening to this, I know there's a lot of astrology enthusiasts that sometimes like listen to the podcast and their partners like hearing it in the background. So I'm speaking secretly to you, the partner in the background of this podcast right now. If you're looking for a good gift for the person in your life who listens to this podcast a lot, they might really enjoy getting a copy of my book, Hellenistic Astrology, which you can get from Amazon. And then you can also, if you wanted to go even further, my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is this comprehensive course in ancient astrology, there's also an option to buy that as a gift when you purchase the course during checkout. There's actually a gift option, and that would be a great gift for the holiday season. So I just wanted to put that out there because one of the things I'm going to continue doing and have been doing and enjoying lately is each month I do a webinar with students of my Hellenistic astrology course. And we've been doing a lot of chart work over the past few months. And the last webinar we did a check-in where we talked with people and I interviewed different students about how the eclipses went in September and what major changes occurred in their life. And it was a really interesting series that we did over the course of 2 months of going through that whole experience together and hearing those stories firsthand from different students as they applied the techniques and the sort of perspective that you learn from my Hellenistic astrology course and that complete system that takes you from beginner concepts up through intermediate and advanced ones for reading birth charts. So if you'd like more information about that and signing up for the course, you can go to theastrologyschool.com. And I'm going to be doing my next webinar sometime probably around the second weekend in December for that, unless you and I have to do the forecast that weekend. We need to check in about scheduling that here pretty soon because we're coming up on the end of the year, which means it's year ahead forecast time, Austin.
Oh no, dude, I began my grim dive into the minutia of 2026 last week. I know.
Good. Okay.
I'm right now I'm in March and I'm feeling the
Yeah.
tension.
Yeah, you've been like texting me sometimes excitedly, sometimes alarmed about like different combinations that you're finding for next year. And I'm also starting to begin that research because Lisa and I are going to sit down and we're going to work on and we're going to finish our year ahead electional astrology report for 2026 this month. And I hope to launch that at some point during the course of this month, probably later in the month, I'm guessing towards when Mercury stations direct. But I know people are waiting for that, but I'll have that out by the end of November as well.
Nice.
Yeah. All right, my friend. I think that's it for this forecast. Thanks a lot for joining me. This is awesome. I'm glad we did this today. This went really good. And yeah, it was fun talking to you.
Yeah, ditto. Let's do it again next month.
Why don't we? All right, we'll do it. All right, so we'll be back again, same time, same place, 1 month from now, late November, and we will assess everything that happened and check in again at that point, and then also do the forecast for December. So if you want to join that live, there's been a group of patrons joining us live and putting their comments here through my page on patreon.com/astrology podcast if you want to join us for that at the end of November. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks everyone for watching. Good luck this month in November, and we'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly Electional Astrology Podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sadlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course, you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the United Astrology Conference, which is happening September 3rd through the 9th, 2026 in Chicago. Find out more information at uacastrology.com.